so back. Welcome to Swing Pass. I am Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. It is 2025, and boy, do we have a lot of news to share with you from across the Ultimate Frisbee Association. Starting at the top with the announcement of the expansion Vegas Bighorns joining the West Division for the upcoming season, and along with that, a tectonic shift within the divisional alignments. 4 divisions, 6 teams in each. The East and the Central remain the same, but the South and the West are in a little bit of jumble. Cam and I will get to that later in this episode. And in addition to that, free agency, which started off a little bit slow this offseason, but boy, has it picked up, especially this week and today when we are recording on Tuesday, January 7th. A whole host of international imports coming into the league in 2025, including the 2-time reigning Ultiworld European Player of the Year, Don Demare, joining the Chicago Union. Cam, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about the Union's additions heading into this new season. It's been a minute, buddy. I know we've kind of taken some time, some personal space to get reacclimated during this long off season. We're still 3.5 months away from the start of the 2025 season, but it really feels like we've got a whole bunch of momentum and inertia in our favor at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. You know, we went from recording 1 to 2 times a week every week, and then took some time off. And I was sometimes finding myself during the week at night being like, I feel like there's something I need to be doing right now. And instead, I just, wasted it doing other stuff, that playing video games, watching.
I was going to say World of Warcraft. It's World of Warcraft, in case anyone is wondering.
It has been
what
recently.
Cam is doing with his extra time.
Yeah, a lot of hardcore World of Warcraft at the moment. So, yeah, I mean, it's great to be back, though. I'm excited. You're right about the free agency. It started off with not a lot of news, but it did start off with some impactful news, even though it was just less names flying around. But man, over the last couple of weeks, it has really picked up. And the thing I keep thinking about is we're at the beginning of January. We are nowhere near rosters being set for teams across the league. So, like, if this is where we're at already, I am really keeping my eyes peeled for, like, what else is going to pop up. I've loved the addition of the Inside the UFA that Ian Toner has been working on. And that extra reporting, because it really is starting to feel like the off seasons that we hear about in other professional leagues, where there's rumors circulating about where players might end up and who they might join forces with, and like which people are going to be back, not going to be back. And that level of reporting just hasn't really existed to this extent in the past. And so it's gotten me a lot more excited for these moves. And, last year was a pretty momentous offseason in terms of player movement, especially with Jeff Babbitt. The at the time, he was the current MVP then. He's the current MVP now, as we're looking at it again with a different team. But that was the biggest move we had seen as far as one individual move. And now we're seeing maybe not moves quite as big as the MVP moving, but we're seeing a lot of very good players either change teams or coming into the league for the first time. And that is super exciting. And I can't wait to see what other moves. I know we're still waiting on, like, where's Khalif going to be and some other names. So it should make for a really interesting few months gearing up for the season.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly concur with you. It kind of got into motion with the announcement from the reigning champion Minnesota Wind Chill inking James Pollard away from the Philadelphia Phoenix, ostensibly their franchise player over the past couple seasons, and then also signing on all defense perennial selection at this point, Justin Burnett, away from the Atlanta Hustle. Basically the top defense in the league, again, the team that won the title in August, signing 2 of the best playmakers who can really add to the takeaway potential of an already fantastic Wind Chill D-line. That happened in November, and it's been a little quiet since then. But boy, this week with the announcement that Chicago will be adding a couple of huge players in Demare and Bontemps, as well as re-adding Paul Arters and Nate Goff, as well as signing away from Indianapolis and your former teammate Xavier Payne, should add a whole bunch of intrigue to a Chicago franchise that is looking to build off of the momentum of 5 straight postseason appearances without a title. And it sounds like they're not done yet. And then in the East Division, you've got the resurgence of the Toronto Rush, who, began their franchise with a title in 2013 and were a perennial championship weekend contender, But over the last 4 seasons, they've kind of taken a tumble to the cellar dweller position in that East Division. But with the announcement of them signing 3 of the top players from Europe today, thanks to the reporting of Ian Toner, it really sounds like the Rush might rebound. The East Division looks even better than it did last season when, again, you mentioned the Babbitt move, sort of reconfiguring the powers that be in the toughest division in the league. Like, there's just so much to dig into there, to say nothing of Seattle re-signing most of its core after their semifinal appearance last year, Colorado bringing on Tobias Brooks from Carolina, one of the most talented young players in the entire sport. We'll get into that later. Like, there is just so much fodder to talk about with movement. I agree with you. There isn't kind of the maybe MVP caliber Babbitt sized move happening this offseason yet. I've heard some buzz, but it's massive right now. It just feels like out of the sort of darkness of the winter, there's now all this fire of the upcoming 2025 season. And I wanted to kind of launch from that into some of the most exciting news, which always kind of follows around any expansion announcement. And that is the addition of the Vegas Bighorns, as I led off this episode talking about. They will join the West Division. Owner James Shorey has talked with Ian Toner, and you can find that news on the watchufa.com website. Some, as you mentioned, fantastic reporting from Toner, talking with Shorey about his intentions, launching this Vegas team from a location that isn't historically known for too much ultimate success, but with the allure of that enigmatic and, volatile and light-filled city that is Vegas. It sounds like they're going to kind of take the model of other professional sports within that city and attract some out-of-town talent. Now, the Bighorns have yet to sign any names. There is the perpetual comeuppance of Joel Clutton, who, if you remember listening to the show, helped propel Salt Lake to their first championship game appearance in 2023 with one of the most miraculous plays in league history, tipping a pass to Elijah Jaime at the buzzer at the end of the fourth quarter, pushing the game into overtime, which the Shred eventually won. Clutton was an all-defensive player in 2023. He did not suit up for the team this past season. He has been away from the league, but owner Shorey has targeted Clutton as kind of a tentpole figure in establishing this Bighorns franchise. And it'll be interesting to see if he is either the mover that kind of starts the landslide of signings, or if somebody else comes in and they can really be the star around which this whole galaxy of Bighorns lineups forms, right? There's just a lot of speculation about this Vegas team. There isn't a whole bunch of knowns, but I think given the reporting that we do have, there's just going to be a lot of intrigue heading into that week 1 matchup, as well as just what sort of players matriculate into that team.
Yeah, and there was some reporting that they had targeted some big names. Now, what does that mean? Like, what to them is a big name versus what would we consider a big name? Is that just them kind of puffing their chest out and bluffing? Is it like fact? I don't know. A lot of big names are signed already, but there's certainly plenty of big names out there that are not. There are players who maybe who have taken time off, who might be interested in coming back. There are players who we expect to return to teams who actually haven't signed contracts yet. So it's possible that they're luring some people away from places that they've been. But yeah, it's really interesting because Vegas is not a place, when you think of the places like ultimate hotbeds, like places that are known for producing really strong ultimate, Vegas does not come to mind. There are lots of other cities you would put ahead of them. So it does become interesting to know how much local talent are they going to have versus how much are they going to bring in. And I also started thinking about some other teams in their first seasons trying to like do the all-star model of like, let's put a bunch of people together. And we've seen it work in the past. We saw it work in Dallas when they had Dylan Freechild and Jimmy Mickle and Kirk Gibson and Bo Kittredge. And, they put together basically a who's who list of players that everyone knows. We also saw San Diego try this. I don't know if you remember that experiment, the Kirk Gibson, Jimmy Mickle. I think,
Oh yeah.
And it failed spectacularly. I think they won 4 games the whole season.
They went 7-7. They were
end up 7-7. Okay.
Phenomenally mediocre.
They started off really badly, if I remember correctly, and I think they finally won some games at the end was how it turned up. But they were essentially almost eliminated from the playoffs, if I remember, by mid-season because they were just 2-6 or something like that. But it just didn't work out the way that we saw in Dallas, where they went undefeated and won a title that everyone knew they were going to win basically from their first game. So, but we've also talked about how in the league now, the way it currently sits, we don't think that model of just throwing together a bunch of all-star players from different places really is the path that it once was, because teams are so much better coached and people have started to figure out strategies, and the cohesiveness matters so much more. And I think there's no better proof of that than watching Minnesota win the title last year with a team that was just so cohesive. I don't think anyone, and I think even if you ask the Minnesota team themselves, were you the most talented team in the league? If you were just to put some Madden stats up there, would you have been more talented than every other team? No, I don't think anyone would say that. But were they the best group cohesively that also did have talent? I'm not saying they didn't. They clearly have talent. But it was their cohesion. It was the defensive adjustments and system that they put out there. It was playing the conditions better than any other team. It was a conglomeration of a bunch of things that you could not have done if you just put an all-star team out there that didn't have that teamwork, that mentality of being a team. So it'll be really interesting to see who they can piece together, if they can put some people who have played together before, or is it going to be complete build chemistry from the ground up where we have a completely new squad? We'll know once we start seeing some signings.
Well, and where my mind goes a little bit is kind of how Indianapolis has constructed this roster over the past several seasons, where you guys have kind of targeted pods of players in specific regions and brought on 3 to 5 dudes from a specific area that kind of know how to play together amongst themselves, and then integrating those pieces into a larger whole. Does Vegas sort of take a cadre of Arizona players, a few Colorado guys, maybe a few Utah people, and sort of cobble together a line of sort of mix and match? Or are they just going to go full potpourri and assemble things based on the talent that they have? I don't know. Their tryouts will be upcoming in the next couple of weeks, and it remains to be seen kind of what direction they move in. We've talked extensively and throughout the history of the show about the Wild Wild West and how there's this sort of premium on offensive explosives and a little bit of a detriment on hard-nosed defense. Does Vegas maybe invert that a bit, especially with them courting a Joel Clutton, and start to focus more on the defensive side of the disc and being able to take it away from their opponents? Or do they kind of go with the flow of all their divisional rivals, get a little bit more Huck happy, a little bit more engaged with the long ball? It remains to be seen, because again, it's just one giant question mark on a mystery box that is Vegas. And the thing is that it's Vegas, right? This is a pro sports capital that is kind of in a bit of a renaissance right now, that is known for its almost mercenary quality of attracting talent regardless of what the other strings are attached. And so can they kind of carry on that almost Raiders-like ability to maybe take some pieces off of the scrap heap and recondition them into what the Bighorns need? I don't know. I'm just really intrigued by what direction that all goes in. And with that, I'd like to move into kind of the main portion of what we're going to be talking about in this episode, and that is divisional realignment. Now, This happened in 2021 when the league was coming back after a year postponement due to the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic. When we had the Super Atlantic Division with like 8 teams in it, it was a amalgam of some South teams and some East teams, and then a couple of South teams went into the West Division with the 2 Texas teams at the time, Dallas and Austin, going over there and playing against the rest of the West. This is kind of the first real divisional alignment that we've had since the introduction of the South in 2015. This is pretty significant. And I know I talked at the beginning of the episode that the Central and East will remain the same. So to just quickly go through that, the Central will once again be the Chicago Union, the Detroit Mechanix, Indianapolis AlleyCats, Madison Radicals, Minnesota Wind Chill, and the Pittsburgh Thunderbirds. East will be Boston Glory, DC Breeze, Montreal Royale, New York Empire, Philadelphia Phoenix, and the Toronto Rush. But then once we get into the South and the West, that's where things really get interesting, particularly the South, where we have this like parallel along the lower aspect of the continental United States.
They are South.
They are all South. They are below the Mason-Dixon line. Yeah. South is now Atlanta, Austin, Carolina, Houston Havoc, and most notably 2 West Division imports in the Los Angeles Aviators and the San Diego Growlers will be joining the South. And then in the West, they add Vegas, and then the rest of the West is very similar to last season, obviously without the 2 SoCal teams. You've got Colorado Summit, Oakland Spiders, the Oregon Steel, newly rebranded this fall, and then Salt Lake Shred, and the reigning divisional champs, the Seattle Cascades. Vegas, obviously, at this point, kind of slots in on the bottom position of that West Division, but given Oregon's struggles in the past few seasons and given just the tumultuousness of that division, it feels like it's kind of always in upheaval. I just really don't know what to expect from the West. And then the South, Atlanta is coming off of 2 straight regular season divisional titles, 2 1 seeds going into the playoffs. But after 2 heartbreaking divisional championship losses at home in the final moments, it's and a couple of notable retirements in Bobby Lay and Matt Smith, one of the all-time leading goal scorers in this league's history. It remains to be seen exactly where the hustle will pick back up. I mean, they've still got Brett Hallsmeyer, Hayden Austin-Knabb, Austin Taylor, and a slew of talent. Mm-hmm. But given some of this rejiggering and given maybe a little bit more of a travel demand, depending on how the SoCal away trips suss out when we get a full sense of the schedule, this could be a very different looking South. I felt like the past couple of seasons, the top end teams of Atlanta, Austin, and Carolina kind of fed off of the lower opponents in that division in Houston and the now dismantled Dallas Legion. LA and San Diego aren't going to be those kinds of sacrificial lambs going into 2025. San Diego last year especially was a team that just did not give up easy games. I know their record wasn't fantastic, but the Growlers are well coached. They run deep. Travis Dunn, being the franchise leader of that team, kind of is the emblem of their hardworking consistency. He's got now, I think, 6 or 7 straight all UFA selections to his name.
Yeah, something wild.
And just like that spirit has just suffused throughout the rest of the team, right? Like they added on a whole bunch of new players last year, and it just felt like Kevin Stewart and Kayla Helton were able to dial in exactly where those players fit in both their offensive and defensive lineups in ways that I think will be kind of challenging for some of the more traditional Southern teams to face. I think that they're sort of used to getting that Dallas-Houston lull to sort of recharge. And I don't know if San Diego is going to be that kind of opponent for the top end of the South Division.
Yeah, I think San Diego definitely showed throughout, especially through the second half of last season, just the improvement that they had, like being in games that at the beginning of the season, we thought they really had no shot at. I mean, their first game of the season, if I remember correctly, was a 28-14 loss to Seattle.
They got blown out, man.
Yeah, they looked like they might be at the bottom of the division with Portland. Like that's kind of what it looked like. And as the season went on, you saw them building and getting better. And then they got to the point where they were basically competitive in every game. Like they were right there with Colorado. They were right there. And I believe, at least for a while, I don't remember how the game finished, but they were with Salt Lake in a game. And it was just like, they showed that like that young talent that they had started accumulating from the year before and then added last year was building towards something. Like you said, incredibly well coached. It was clear that they made adjustments throughout the season. Travis Dunn has been one of the best players in the league for years and doesn't really...
Say it. That dude doesn't get enough flowers, man. Travis Dunn can do everything on a Frisbee field, and we just don't talk enough about him.
Yeah, I think he, when they had those teams that were making it to championship weekend every year, it was like, yeah, he's really good. But it was like, yeah, they have other good players too. Like they had Goose Helton on those teams, and they had other players that were like notable names that were contributing, but they all have kind of gone for one reason or another. And he's still there and still just doing the thing. Like he clearly is capable of being a part of a team or being the guy who's like, okay, get on my back and I'm going to carry us as far as we can go. And he would never say that. He's way too humble of a person, but like we will say it for you, Travis. Like you're phenomenal, and I don't see signs of slowing down anytime soon. LA, I'm a little more worried about. Everett Shapiro, just notably, one of their best receiving threats, and one of their, how do I want to put this? He's a wild card. He's like Charlie from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I feel like. I mean, he literally he did one of the greatest shows of like conservation of greatness you ever see in their Oakland game last year, where he goes up, skies somebody, just posterizes an Oakland defender, and immediately makes a terrible throw. Or no, then he dishes it off and goes to try to catch the score and jumps way too early and misses it. And it's just like, man, that if that doesn't just show like he got way too hype, he like gave him the too small before he made the throw too. I mean, it was phenomenal. I loved it. He's in New York now. There's rumors I've been hearing of Pavel returning to Chicago. If that happens, you're talking about losing arguably your top receiver, or one of at least, Sean McDougal, I believe, if he's still there, obviously great receiving option. But then you're talking about losing a guy that's as just calming of a presence in the backfield that you can almost have, like somebody who's just going to almost always make the right throw, who's going to be available and who's going to complete throws at a high rate, and you can just trust him with the disc in his hands. If losing both of those, I have a lot of questions for how they can score, honestly. Like, what are you going to do to generate offense? So I'm looking to see if like a Brandon Van Dusen can come back from injury and maybe be effective, because he had a great year 2 years ago before suffering a back injury last year, and who they compare with him in the backfield. So that if there's like, I'm a little nervous for LA because they could beat up on Portland before, and I think they're gonna have a much tougher time in the South.
Oregon got their lone win of 2024 against LA, and now obviously LA shifts out of the West Division. But Aviators, I totally agree. There's just so much up in the air. They lose their head coach and Jeff Landisman, who has been a culture force in LA for years and years, not only for obviously introducing his son to the sport and Danny Landisman being kind of a prodigal talent, but you listen to some of the players, and Everett Shapiro said as much in Ian Toner's reporting on it. Landisman, Jeff, the father and the coach, he's just had imprints all over basically every player who has come through the Aviators over the past couple of years. And the Aviators did announce that Jacob Baumer will be taking over as the head coach, longtime player for the Aviators, longtime presence within that community. I have faith in him as a new head signal caller, but the Landisman sort of wake that he leaves will be noticeable. And now them shifting into a South Division where they just don't know the opponents as well, and all these other questions, I agree with you. I wonder where the Aviators end up. And, it was only, what is it now? 17 months since they were in the West Division title game against Salt Lake Shred in 2023, looking like they could have a puncher's chance in that. game on the road in a very tough environment at Zions Bank Stadium. And now all of a sudden we're kind of at the other end of the spectrum and wondering what's next for this Aviators team. It felt like they were going to be this up and coming force in the West Division. And now all of a sudden they're in the South needing to answer a lot. But I wanted to shift from the South over to the West because they had Vegas, but with Colorado's additions, with Oakland being kind of quiet, I think in an interesting way so far this offseason, I think there's going to be some bigger moves coming out of the Spiders. Salt Lake coming off of what I think you could charitably say is a disappointing season, despite making it the division title game. They had title aspirations, especially after their 2023 campaign. And through injuries and everything else, the Shred just could not live up to expectations in 2024. I think they're going to have a big chip on their shoulder coming into this new season. And then you've got Seattle, this new sort of prince of the division, who are still so young, still feel like they have an additional level to their ceiling or two, needing to kind of defend their throne within the West. There's just a lot going on out there that I think is going to make it a really interesting 2025 campaign. And with that, I just wanted to get into quickly the winners and losers of divisional realignment. I'm only going to choose one. I don't know why I listed plural, but winners, I actually want to go with the South Division's Houston Havoc. You know, they enter their third season in the league going into 2025. They were just announcing over the past set of days a return of their captains and core, starting with Ben Lewis, Jimmy Zuraw, as well as Brian Gafoffer, Mark Baldoff, and Brendan Adams. That kind of quintet has been a terrific base for a team that is still looking to find its identity. And I think even though they won't get to beat up on Dallas as they did last year for 4 wins, I think that this move will actually be pretty beneficial for the Havoc. I think there are signs that they can punch up a little bit harder. I know that they've had some pretty bad losses to Atlanta, Carolina, and Austin over the past 2 seasons, but they're getting there. I mean, they had that game in week 10 or 11 at Austin where they were still playoff eligible, and they were within a goal or two heading into the second half against the Soul on the road before Austin's defense just ran a break train on them and kind of blew it open. But Houston has some stuff there. They've got a little juice that I think a lot of people are taking for granted, and I think maybe in the South Division they can find a little bit more of that success. I'm really interested in a Houston-San Diego matchup. I just think that that's going to be a fun first-time meeting for both squads, and I think that Houston is going to be a little bit more able to punch up with some of these teams, particularly if they can claim some of the salvage parts from the dissolution of the Legion team. If they can pick up an Alec Wilson-Holiday, who just led the league in goals this past year, if they can get a Connor DeLuna or a Jake Floyd, one of the throwers from Dallas who have a lot of talent but were sort of tasked with too much volume. Jason Hustad, led the league in assists 2 years ago, I believe it was, and is just a howitzer with the disc. You know, if they get a couple of those talent pieces added in and can find the right positions for them, head coach Bexforth has been fantastic at doing that with the Havoc in her first 2 seasons. I think they can be a little spicy going into this year. And I know we talked about LA and their possible struggles heading into 2025. My loser is going to be Oregon because LA shifts out of that division, and it just feels like West is coming up a little bit, like that floor is just raising a little bit. Again, you don't have LA there. Obviously, Vegas comes in, but not knowing the schedule, Oregon might only get a game or 2 against the Bighorns. And then you've got the rest of the slate, which Colorado looks to be better. Salt Lake looks to be better. Seattle's re-signed Lucas Ambrose and most of their core from last year already. Oakland was a playoff team last year and actually gave Seattle a pretty good run in that first round matchup in Seattle. The Spiders were closer than I think any of us gave them credit for, and they're so young. They can make a leap or 2 without us even being in anticipation of it. So I think Oregon Steel might have another year of growing, but you know, they're from an area where the club team just won the club championship this past fall with Rhino. Yeah. They might add a couple of those players, see if they can get back a Rafi Hayes or something of that caliber. who knows? Like there's just so much talent in that Pacific Northwest corridor that if the Steel get some of these big names like Colorado, Chicago, and Toronto have done over the past week, they might see themselves in a little bit better position too. So I know I just called them a loser and then absolutely threw that out the window and said Oregon has some potential, but yeah, those are my winners and losers from divisional realignment.
I think they'll be gaining Lucas Conieris most likely. He's moving out there for grad school. So for the next couple of years, I know his plan was to play for the Portland, now Oregon team. So not a bad player to add.
I don't want to interrupt too long, but like that's a really interesting one because one of the things that Oregon struggled with last year wasn't throwing talent. It was having a reliable pivot handler to balance out the absolutely bodacious downfield attack of David Baram and Ben Thones, who were two of the most prodigious huckers in the entire league last year. Slightly undersized throwers, but man, do those dudes have some arms. And I think Conieris would be a perfect addition and complement to those two, at kind of balancing out the rest of that offense. Like Steel have parts, they just kind of need a certifiable star that it all kind of centers around, right?
Yeah, and I mean he comes with some experience of like winning in the UFA. Like he's been to the playoffs 2 times. He's been a part of our team since I believe 2021. A part of the AlleyCats. So he's got some games under his belt. He's played in some big games. He's won a playoff game. He's played in a divisional championship game and played very well. Actually, was arguably the best player in that game, even in a losing effort. So yeah, a lot of potential there. I'm excited for the opportunity for him to go to a team where he definitely has the opportunity. He's a great leader too. He was a captain for AlleyCats last year, and I told him at the end of the season, like he might be the best captain I've had ever. Like just the attitude he brings and the way he handles himself. So yeah, excited for that move. And if everything works out and he does play, I know that was his intention last time I spoke with him. So yeah, big pickup for them. And yeah, if they can grab a couple of
speculation.
Yeah, speculation. If they can grab some other players, then my loser is gonna be, I kind of already mentioned them, but I think it is LA. Like for me, you're moving into a division. You've already lost Ever Shapiro. Rumors of potentially losing Pavel Yanis, your new coach. Trending in the wrong direction over the last season. Just kind of a lot of question marks is really why. It's a lot of question marks, and now you're going to a division where we think Houston's probably going to get better, probably going to pick up some of those Dallas guys. How many? I don't know.
Austin might be also a winner.
Austin could take up some of them. Houston could take some of them, and we'll see what happens. But it just kind of feels like for LA, the path to getting to, they were 3-9 last year. Like I would struggle to see how. I feel like 3 wins would be really hard to get in that division, given the talent you'd have to face. And I worry for their move on the. Sometimes the move can galvanize a team, but new matchups and there's a lot of unknowns on both sides. But talent wise and just from what we saw last year, I think they're kind of coming out on the bad end of this. But my winner is actually San Diego. This is a team who, they have 4 teams ahead of them in the standings last year. And Salt Lake, we know is still going to be good. They're going to be healthy, hopefully at the beginning of the year. And if they're healthy, I think you can still make an argument they're the best team in that division. Seattle, as you mentioned, has re-signed almost everyone. Right now, the only person it looks like they might not re-sign, who was kind of a big piece from last year, is Khalif. But I think they can survive his absence with the young talent that they had that was coming up last year, assuming they all take another step forward. And I think looking at Colorado, I think they're getting a little bit of addition by they're getting addition of Toby Brooks, addition by subtraction, maybe, with Nethercutt being out of the picture completely. So you're not wondering, is he a part of the team? Is he not? Because like if he's there all the time, he's a great addition to the team. When it's we're not sure if he's on board or how many games we're going to get him, and when you have that question looming, I think that's where it becomes hard because he's clearly an offensive player that you want on the field if he's there. But then, like, if he's not there, now your whole offensive identity shifts. And I think just kind of knowing going in, hey, we're not going to have this piece, and they can plan for that, it makes it better for like the outlook of the whole season. As you mentioned, Oakland, like they're young. We haven't heard any news right now. I'm assuming no news is good news, and that most of those players, or maybe all of them, are coming back. San Diego's up and coming, but they have to leapfrog at like 2 teams to get into the playoffs. And now they're moving to a division where I think, Houston has been bottom 2 in that division. I think Austin looked like they took a step back last year. Mm-hmm. So while they're trending back from where they were when they made championship weekend a couple years ago, San Diego's trending forward. They're trending up. And really, like Atlanta and Carolina's missing some pieces. We saw in a report earlier that was released earlier today. They have some people who aren't coming back who are big pieces for them. We know Atlanta's lost a couple guys. They seem to have most of everyone else back on board. I assume those 2 teams are still going to be like the class of that division. But I think that 3rd spot is still up in the air, especially with San Diego trending upwards towards the end of last season. I think they can definitely be competitive with all the teams in that division. It would not surprise me if they found themselves in the playoffs, nabbing that 3rd spot. So I think that's a big win for them. They just have less to compete with to make it to the playoffs than what they did out west.
2 things. I love your point about Nethercutt. It's obviously never been a doubt as to whether he can perform on the field when he's there, but I think the lack of consistency of him being available in the lineup has been a big quagmire for Colorado over the last season and a half. You could really feel it at the beginning of last year when their offense was just so touch and go. They were absent Quinn Finer, Nethercutt was there and then not. That inability to know whether you have full field throwing range or not, it really changes the scope of how that Summit team attacked. I mean, remember in 2022 and 2023 when they were sort of championing the West Division in a certain way, like their whole identity was built around the long ball and their ability to just complete hucks at such a high clip. They had Nethercutt, but then they also have Quinn Finer and Alex Atkins, 2 of the best hucking throwers in league history since that stat was developed in 2021. I mean, Quinn Finer's completing above 80% of his deep throws, and they didn't have that available. Then you take away Nethercutt, and all of a sudden that offense just looks completely different. But by the end of the season last year, it felt like they had sort of recobbled together a different identity that I think will sustain into this new year, particularly as we'll get into in a second with the addition of Tobias Brooks. And then the other point that you made about San Diego, I think the thing, and you mentioned it kind of earlier in this episode, that really comes down to it, they're fantastically coached. They took that 14-point loss right on the chin to begin their season, and then they only got better. That was their worst loss by far. They left it in the rearview mirror, and then they marched forward. And that was after just hellish offseason. I mean, we haven't really touched on what that franchise had to deal with in the wake of Goose Helton's injury. But now with him kind of being more on the sidelines, becoming almost a consultant or coaching presence, training again with the team, just being around, you've really, I think, felt the heart and soul of that Growlers organization return. And you remember like, oh, snap, there's some good framework here. Like this team did win back-to-back division titles in 2019 and then in 2021, obviously with 2020 not being played by any team. But, San Diego has some success in the not too distant past. And I think that you're absolutely right to kind of say like, don't sleep on them this year. I would almost ask us in this episode to try to rank or plot out the playoff teams in each of the 4 divisions. But without a schedule, I just want to save that a couple more weeks when everything gets finalized. Right now, we're in the
That's
last
fair.
stages of figuring all of that out. It sounds like at the beginning of February, we'll have full confirmation of all 24 team schedules. And at that point, I think we should do who makes which playoffs. But
Yeah.
for now, I'd love to move ahead to all of this juicy free agency news. I think we should start a little bit chronologically because we didn't get to touch on it when it happened, and that is what I mentioned at the top of the show: Minnesota Wind Chill signing James Pollard, the star from Philadelphia, and then Justin Burnett, the defensive star from Atlanta, bringing them on board. That Wind Chill have also announced a host of returning starters, including Josh Klain, Cameron Lacey, who is on all defensive first team last year, Will Brandt, Gordon Larson, the most improved player in the UFA in 2024. It sounds like they're basically running it back in 2025 and will have a very vicious defense of their league title. What do you take, both as an analyst and as a divisional rival opponent, with Minnesota adding two players the caliber of James Pollard and Justin Burnett?
Yeah, I mean, it just makes them a whole lot more dynamic defensively, not only when they're playing defense, but on the counterattack, I think is where you're really going to see the big difference with those guys, because I think they were always good at generating blocks. And they were always one of the top defensive teams in the league already at break rate. You have a guy like Dylan DeClerc who's been at or near the top of, blocks in the league several times. Mm-hmm. They have added a bunch of pieces over the years, guys like Brett Bergmeyer, Sam Berglund, like Cameron Lacey, guys who, with Berglund and Lacey, of course, it's more about their polls and how they've been able to affect the game that way that sets up the defense for success. But then you add a guy in Justin Burnett who has been, one of the highest blocks per game players over the last couple of years. You have James Pollard, who you could make an argument had the best individual game that anybody had last year in his game at DC.
Oh, that game was nuts.
Where he put Philadelphia on his back. I think they went to double OT or double OT.
Double OT, it went to sudden death. Pollard had two different buzzer beaters in that game, including at the end of regulation to send it to overtime. And he had 900 total yards.
Yeah, he was nearing 1,000 yards. It was a stupid, amazing game, and he went and played club in Minnesota this year. We maybe should have seen this coming, but I know he talked to me about how much he enjoyed that experience and how much fun he had, and it looks like they parlayed that pretty quickly into a contract. But I think what really just makes them so dynamic is, first off, James Pollard is one of the best end of quarter players in the league, whether defense or offense. He is as good as anyone. I honestly think he is. We don't talk about him in the same breath as Jeff Babbitt at the end of a quarter, and I think he really is kind of on that same level. It's just that Jeff Babbitt has been doing it for teams that have been winning championships and making the playoffs. They're way more visible. But really, if you go back through the film, he's done this with Babbitt in the area. So it's he's literally gone head to head with Babbitt, and he's won some of those matchups. And that's it's kind of sad we don't get to see that matchup during the regular season anymore, because those two in the air together is a fun thing to watch. But really, he's adding another element to that defense, being so good in the air, being so good in buzzer beater situations. But on a turnover, I think there's so much more dynamic on offense with a guy like James Pollard, especially, who can really affect with both his throws and by stretching the field. They are known in Minnesota for that. We know that they're looking to score on a turnover really in 3 throws or less. Mm-hmm. There's a wild stat. I watched through some of their games a couple years ago and really broke down, okay, when they get the disc on defense, what's their success rate in breaking when they make 3 throws or less versus when they make more than 3 throws? And it drops off a cliff dramatically if they have to make more than 3 throws. Well, the guy like James Pollard out there, I think you're going to have a lot of opportunities to score in 3 throws or less, because he's either going to pick it up and he's going to have a streaking Dylan DeClerc going down there and he can definitely put it the full length of the field, or he's going to be the guy down on the other end catching it. And how many players are going to be able to play offense, get a turnover, and then go chase James Pollard deep and try to beat him in the air? Not very many. So Justin Burnett's obviously going to be out there, and he's going to be making blocks, and I think he's going to fit really well into their system as well. My biggest question will be, he likes to play a little bit kind of roamer, like he likes to kind of abandon his guy and kind of hunt down some blocks. And he's talked about this on podcasts before about how you do have to play with a little bit of risk to generate blocks on defense. But Dylan DeClerc's kind of already that guy for them. You can't really afford to have two people doing that at the same time. So does that mean that one of them has to do kind of an identity shift and become more of like a lockdown man defender? Or do they kind of, only have one on the field at a time on defense? I'm not really sure. So I'm kind of interested to see what that dynamic looks like.
I think Minnesota is going to have two top line defensive units, and I think that they're going to be able to throw a myriad of looks at opponents. I mean, look, you mentioned DeClerc. This Minnesota team has already been one of the best at taking away the middle part of the field from opposing offenses. Now they throw in Burnett. It's a snake pit to try to move the disc through the middle part of the field against this team. I mean, it's just so schematically on point, and now they've got this just top-end talent in order to take it to the next level. I mean, Minnesota is going to be terrifying for you all in the Central Division to face up against defensively. I think my biggest question comes down to how often are they both available and where exactly are they put into use? Burnett had a little bit of, I think, an injury problem in the middle part of last year. He missed a few games. Pollard, has switched back and forth across offense and defense over the past couple of seasons for Philadelphia. So he hasn't had a really signature role for that team. And so I think my biggest question is just where exactly do they fit and can they make their talents the most out of that spot? Because I think that they're coming from positions where they just got to let all of their talent flourish despite whatever else is happening around them. Obviously, Atlanta has had a lot more success than Philly in the past couple of years, but Atlanta, similarly, just kind of allowed Burnett to do Burnett things. I don't know that that's going to necessarily apply coming up to Minnesota with a new team where he's not as familiar with. And so I'm just interested to see how that all susses out. And just back a point to you talking about best end of quarter athletes. I think there's 4 that exist on kind of the Rushmore, and then there's a precipitous drop, and it's James Pollard, Jeff Babbitt, Brett Halsmeyer, and Jacob Fairfax. Yeah. You take those 4 dudes, I'll just watch them go play 500. You just throw jump balls at them for like half an hour. I'll watch it. I think with Nate Goff coming back in, he probably gets added to that list in some way just because of how dominant he is in the air and how big he is as a player. But yeah, I mean, Pollard just adds a different level for this Minnesota team, particularly possibly picking up an extra score at the buzzer. So, to the victors go the spoils first in this situation, and it remains to be seen as to whether Matt Rader comes back to this Minnesota team. He was kind of a spot placement starter for them last year, but boy, did everyone on that wind chill team love having Rader around. I mean, he's a living legend in this sport, and just having his kind of presence out there on the field, you could feel it in the background of their championship weekend push where he had that layout block on the end zone against DC and is just a presence, man. Like I witnessed it on the sideline when Minnesota played at Madison in week 5 of last year. It was notoriously when Raiders plane got delayed. It landed in a different airport than it was supposed to. He rented a car and drove several hours up from, I think, like Kansas City or something. He drove up to Madison, and were it not for a rain delay in that game, he probably would have missed it. But a 2-hour rain delay made it so that he got there, was able to warm up, and then took the field with the team, made a couple of huge plays in the second half for the wind chill. I mean, he's just a consummate gamer and a pro. And I think if he also comes back, they just have a ego line almost in Rader, Pollard, and Burnett, where you just throw those dudes out at an opponent and it's like, man, I just don't have time for this level of player. But there's a lot to cover, so I want to move on from Minnesota. Let's move to the other Central Division team. And as reported on by Ian Toner earlier today, the Chicago Union are entering 2025 with a lot of bluster. I mean, they announced the re-signing of their captainship in Andrew Sjogren, Jack Shanahan, Ben Priest, and Sam Kaminsky. They'll be bringing back Wilson Matthews, who was the team's leading goal scorer last year, Jake Ruben Miller, who was one of the leading block getters. Probably forgetting on a couple people.
Dex Draymond.
Dex Draymond, their leading thrower from last year. And in the beginning half of the season was just on a tear with his ability to throw the deep ball. I mean, he's got that huge lefty backhand that he can just let rip downfield that feels perfect for the kind of runaway fade routes that Sjogren and Wilson Matthews love to run. Felt like they just all had a terrific connection there, and they'll now have another season to develop on that. But in addition to all of those pieces coming back, Chicago adds in again the two-time reigning Ulti-World European Player of the Year in Don Demare, one of the best players at Club Nationals this past fall. He's going to be a machine on the larger field. Like, he is one of those players who just does not fatigue, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he kind of ends up as like a dark horse MVP-ish kind of figure. He just has that level of ceiling. And I really think he's going to enter this team with the kind of focus that will just galvanize to his effort and push him to another level. But in addition to that, they're bringing back Nate Goff, as I mentioned, Paul Arters. They add in Bontemps, another fantastic European player who I'm not as familiar with, so I don't want to speak entirely on him yet. And then we mentioned earlier Xavier Payne, who has been one of the best throwers for the AlleyCats the past couple of years. Infinite range, complete creativity, one of the best hammer throwers in the entire league.
Yeah.
You know, he'll probably slot in on defense, but wouldn't be surprised at all if he took some reps on offense. Just feels like with Draymond and Kaminsky that the handler backfield is kind of settled for the Union at this point on O-line. But man, again, going to kick it over to you because you play this team 2 to 3 times a year. What is your initial reaction to a rival getting that kind of talent add?
It'll be interesting to see how the European players slot in. You know, we got several across the league who are coming in. And it's always interesting to see like the adaptation, right? Because new style with bigger field, shorter stall count, double teams. But you can't deny like the talent that they're like re-adding to, like re-adding a Nate Goff, a Paul Arters, adding in a Xavier Payne, who is certainly good, you know, plays club in Chicago. He's teammates with a lot of those guys during the club season. So he's going to, I'm sure, adjust very quickly to doing things the Chicago Union way. And, you know, mentioned earlier, the rumor that maybe Pavel might be rejoining Chicago. I've heard rumblings of that. If he's back too, I mean, we're talking about putting together a team that I think is just as talented as the teams that made it to championship weekend in 21 and 22. You know, a team that made it to the championship game in 22. I think we're looking at a team that is that talented. The problem that they're going to have is that they're going up against a team in Minnesota who might be more talented and also is coming off of a championship run and also has a lot of young pieces that are developing, like a Gordon Larson, like a Will Brandt, who have been good player. Like Will Brandt's been a good player for them for years now, but he just continues to grow into his role as like the apex of that offense.
Cameron Lacey hasn't played ultimate Frisbee for longer than 2.5 years, and he made an all defensive team and looks like the best puller in the league right now.
Yeah. And then we have guys, you know, the other thing is like some of these Union guys are older. Like Nate Goff is amazing when he's on the field. He's had injury issues. His last season in the UFA, he played one game, had a back injury and didn't play again. He's got a history of these injuries. The 2 years that he was healthy, 21 and 22, when we saw the best versions of Chicago. So if he can stay healthy, that'd be huge for them. And I hope he does. He's awesome player and just the nicest guy. I wish the best for him and staying healthy this year. And if these new pieces come in and slot in, we know they're talented. If they can, you know, get involved and become a team. I mean, we've seen even in years where Chicago hasn't been great, like 2023 comes to mind where, you know, they did make the playoffs, but it was in a central division that was like very clearly top heavy with Indy and Minnesota that year. And then everyone else was a little bit of an afterthought. Even that year where they didn't look very competent compared to previous Chicago teams, they went into Minnesota and won a game. Now you're telling me they have all this talent and they're going to be going into Minnesota. There's just something about that Chicago-Minnesota matchup where it doesn't seem to matter. So I'm excited to see those matchups. They're always tough, no matter how good one team is and how bad the other might be. I think it's very clearly right now a 2-horse race in the Central, and everyone else is going to be fighting for the third playoff spot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as much as, you got to give some amount of flowers to Madison and conquering Chicago in their first round playoff matchup last year. Took a home field seeding for that to happen and 2 overtimes and a whole bunch of late game heroics in order for them to thwart the Union. And, the Union weren't that far off from the wind chill last year. I mean, the home game that they played and hosted against the wind chill, it took a last drive denying block by Noah Hansen in order to secure a 1-goal win for the wind chill. And then when they played in Madison, Chicago put up 25 and blew them out by 5 goals. It looked like Minnesota had almost wrapped up the division by that point, and yet Union wanted to remind them, hey, we are the monster under the bed for you guys. We are the team that upset you after you were up late in 2021 and we took the championship weekend bid from the Central Division. And then 2022, we just ran over everybody. As you mentioned, in 2023, Chicago finished at 6-6, eke into the playoffs, losing the first round last year. They do a little bit better, but still losing the first round this year. Feels like they're building to something. I just wanted to touch on what head coach Dave Woods even mentioned to Ian Toner in the article. And he says, I don't know what my future will look like beyond this year with the team, Woods said. I'm excited. It feels like a last dance type of situation, of course, referring to the Chicago Bulls' famous 1996 run with Phil Jackson, 1998. But Woods continued on, let's try and make a run of this together. And he said, this is a revenge tour. They've been taking these losses personally against other Central Division opponents. And with this added talent, you've seen how the Union learn from their mistakes and really try to improve some of their stuff. And so I think they're kind of in an advantageous position of coming up rather than a Minnesota team who kind of has to defend down, right? Like that to me is always a more precarious position to exist in as a sports team is defending, getting to the top and then having other teams come up at you with that huge target on their back. I think New York made light of that with how easily they dispatch teams at times, but it is not easy being the champ. Everyone wants that win against you. And I think you're really going to see that both in the Central Division and these Chicago, Minnesota matchups, but just generally with how the wind chill are going to play in 2025. There's rumors of some really, really tasty interdivisional matchups against some other potential 1 seeds that Minnesota will have to face, given that they're the champs and now they've got to take on a pretty tough strength of schedule going into the new season. So I'm pretty bullish on the Chicago Union at this point. But again, we still got so many news and moves to move through. You mentioned Everest Shapiro earlier going from LA to New York. He actually tried out for the Empire. I can't remember if it was last year and or the year before, but he's been at Empire tryouts before. I think it was always just kind of on a lark, getting an extra playing opportunity, getting to scrim against the reigning champs. But he's going to be a really interesting fit for that team. You mentioned his potential. He's kind of a Fairfax type where his athleticism allows him to get a pretty large amount of blocks and just be a factor off of the turn. I don't know that he'll necessarily just move into an offensive role with this Empire team. Still remains to be seen exactly how they flesh out their roster around Bang Yacht and Jack Williams, which are currently the only 2 players signed, but it figures that the Empire will return a bulk of their core. But Shapiro could be a really interesting kind of wild card and could be a sign that this New York team, which has been very old in terms of UFA standards over the past couple of seasons, could be getting a little bit more of a youth rejuvenation. You add in Shapiro, Alex Sagami Contreras joined the team last year. He was a real, I think, shot in the arm for the Empire and a much needed kind of youthful vigor to their lineup, especially on the defensive side of the disc. Like, I could see Shapiro really kind of elevating to another level after being essentially like a wide receiver 1A alongside Sean McDougal in the Aviators offense over the past couple of seasons. But moving on from that, what I wanted to actually discuss with you, and one of the more interesting moves, and we kind of anticipated this going into the offseason, but the confirmation just makes it all the more tantalizing. Tobias Brooks, the third leading per game scorer for the runner-up finisher Flyers last year, going to the Colorado Summit. Brooks plays for the Colorado Mama Bird team in college, so this is a kind of expected transfer, but man, you get Brooks, Alex Atkins, Quinn Finer, and Noah Kuhlman running the show for the Colorado offense. That's a lot of scoring. I think last year, those four guys averaged almost 20 scores on goals plus assists per game as a quartet. And they could be even better in 2025. I feel like Kuhlman could be kind of a dark horse MVP candidate if he can figure out some of his turnover issues and just kind of really focusing his pace of play, because all four of those guys, I mean, they're game breakers. Any single one of them could go off against any opponent and almost put up 10 scores or rack up 500 plus yards or just make a Sports Center type play. And Brooks, to me, in addition to Tobe DeCrane, is like a potential future face of this league. Like he just, I struggle to think of players with a toolkit as expansive as Brooks is. And he's what, 21 at this point? I mean, he really reminds me in a way of Tyler DiGirolamo. He kind of has infinite range on his throws. He's an athlete, so he's kind of come out of a receiver mold, but his confidence and his abilities allow him to just sort of roam and do whatever he pleases on the field. And in a Colorado system that's kind of going to be amplifying that specifically for him, I think the sky's the limit for him.
Is there a team in the league that's going to be more annoying to lose to than a team with those four egos all coming right at your face every time they score on you? And I say this not critically. I say this, I love it. Like, Alex Atkins has never been shy about letting you know when he's balling on you. Quinn Finer's a little quieter, but like there's definitely like a swagger to Quinn. Noah Kuhlman, not shy about letting you know when he scored on you. And Tobias Brooks rivals Alex Atkins as maybe like the biggest, like, in your face, I'm going to let you know what just happened player in the league. They're all going to be on the field together. Like, it's going to be absolutely insufferable to play against them. And I cannot wait to watch, because I know some people get really up in arms about this, but I absolutely eat that stuff up. I love the game within the game, you know, the talking and the chatter that happens during the points, between points, after a score, whatever. I think this team's 100% going to be like must-watch TV. Like you mentioned, how prolific Finer and Atkins are as deep throwers, just how accurate they are. You're adding they already had a guy in Noah Kuhlman who is arguably the most athletic guy in the league. You're adding a Tobias Brooks, who is definitely one of, a top tier athlete in the league. They already had a guy like Quinn Finer, who is a great athlete. And it just seems like a recipe for, I feel like when it goes well, it's going to go really well. They're going to look nearly unstoppable. I could also see situations where when it starts to go poorly, it could go real south real fast. But I think this is going to be, as right now with what we know, the most must-watch TV is going to be if those four players are on the field playing offense together. I think that's just going to be absolutely electric, and I can't wait.
Well, and we haven't even touched on their two developing rookies from last year that made, all rookie teams, in Nanaman Fink and Zeke Thorson. Those are some fantastic prospects awesome as well. You throw them in alongside Kuhlman and Brooks. I mean, Thorson looks like a stallion out there at times. Like he was having favorable matchups against Justin Burnett, even though Colorado lost their matchup against Atlanta last season. Thorson was able to keep pace with one of the league's best defenders as a rookie in one of his first starts. I mean, I think the sky is the limit for this team, and you're absolutely right. I think the biggest limitation is going to be between their ears for this Summit team, because if they hit their stride, they're going to be one of the fastest pace of play teams in the entire league, and they could drop 30 on you without blinking, I think, if they really hit their rhythm. Because, again, like you're saying, that the calibration of deep throws, the way that their athleticism sort of sets everything up, they could just move ahead of defenses almost at will, particularly in a West Division that outside of Salt Lake and maybe Seattle will have trouble containing this unit. In my mind, you talk about trash talking. My mind just goes to circling the calendar like 5 times whenever Colorado and Salt Lake play for the first time in 2025. That's going to be a rivalry you cannot miss. I mean, that every single game those two teams play now is just fireworks and trash talking and trading off each other's sort of gestures or celebrations. Last year when they met for the first time, Atkins did a finger wave running away for a goal, and then later in the game, Tony Monga and a couple of the Shred players returned the favor as Salt Lake pulled away. And then famously in their second matchup, it ended with Atkins ripping down a game-saving interception in the end zone and triple spiking it to all the boos by Shred play. I mean, I can't wait. I cannot wait. There's going to be some fun games out in the West Division. And to say nothing of Colorado and Seattle. I mean, Seattle punched his playoff ticket in a gritty back and forth game in Seattle in week 10 of last year. Cascades trading with the Summit back and forth. Like, that's also going to be some primo watching in that game. You got Kuhlman and Ambrose going head to head, 2 former roommates, 2 of the most explosive players this league has ever seen. Like, just so many matchups to pay attention to. But moving on to the last bit of free agency news, got to touch on the Toronto Rush, man.
Yeah.
Team that we have not talked about much, if at all, in the past year. I mean, I like the Rush in glimpses. They're one of those teams who a quarter at a time can kind of surprise you with some of their talent and just play style. But due to injuries, roster turnover, youth, I think too, they've sort of existed towards the bottom end of this East Division for longer than they've wanted to, right? I mean, again, this is a team, Toronto, that made 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, right? They made it in 18. No, 17. They made 5 straight championship weekend appearances between 2013 and 2017. They're a perennial playoff team throughout most of that time, through 2019, I should say. And since then, they haven't been able to muster more than like 4 wins in a season. But now they bring on 3 of the top European players, and I so apologize. I know I'm going to get these wrong. But Rush signed Toms Abelteens, Tom Blasman, and Arvids Karklins. I cannot say Arvid's former name. He took on his partner's name when he got married a couple of years ago, but all 3 have been some of the biggest stars on one of the most winning and successful European squads in the Mooncatchers coming out of Belgium. Arvids is actually Latvian, but the other 2 are Dutch. Toronto, I think, is going to be the biggest dark horse maybe in the league this year, because one of the things that I keep going back to is Liam Grant, sort of the Evan Lepler of European announcing, or maybe we should say that Evan Lepler is the Liam Grant of American ultimate announcing. I don't know exactly how you want to kind of order that, but Liam Grant talked to Evan Lepler today in his Tuesday toss and said that Arvids is maybe the most UFA-ready international prospect that has ever come into this league. And from the limited amount that I've watched of him, I think Grant is completely spot on. I mean, you talk about complete throwing repertoire and ability to go downfield and make whatever play you need. Arvids is that. And then Abelteens and Blasman have been coming on more and more of late. And I just think that these are sort of signature signings that are only going to bring in more talent to the Rush. And that's ostensibly what owner Jim Lloyd has told people again and again, and has been sort of the mission of this offseason and of the Rush reboot, is that they're tired of this losing stuff, man. Like, this is a very confident franchise who expects to win, and they want to start doing that again. And it sounds like they're going to be making roster moves to make sure that that happens. But my biggest question is, what's the upward leverage in that East Division that still has Boston, DC, New York, not to mention a Montreal team that we talked in the pre-recording about is pretty frisky heading into 2025. I mean, they gave a game away at home to DC last year that they could have easily won. They played close against Boston once and beat them in the final weekend of the regular season at home. Now, that final matchup, Boston was playing for nothing, so take that.
They actually threw a game away against them at home too, just a couple weeks before they beat them.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually had one win and 2 very close losses to Boston last year. I mean, they're a team that needed to learn how to win. And I think a year of having that group together, being very competitive, taking care of games they were supposed to take care of, I would not be surprised to see them get to 7 or more wins this year.
Montreal? 7 wins? 7 wins?
Think about
from? I just want to know which of the DC, Boston, and New York teams, which of those are they taking the most? Are you saying that they actually take a game from DC this year?
I'm saying like some of those games that they were in such control that like it's almost like the Patriots Falcons Super Bowl where you saw the odds of the Falcons winning was like 99% and it just slowly went to the point where eventually New England was favored. That's like, it's not too out of pocket to say that like that DC game was about a 99% chance to win. And they just did everything you could to not win the game. That Boston game that they lost, the first home game that they lost to them was a similar situation. Like you're at like 75, 80% odds to win that game based on the game situation, the lead and how late in the game you're at. And they found a way to lose that game. But that's something you do when you're in the first year of learning to be competitive again. And that's something that you learn from. And I think those mistakes get corrected a lot of times the next year. Plus you're adding in the fact that like they're going to have more cohesiveness in that group.
And yet they lost twice to Philly and finished behind them in the standings. Like there's just...
But that's not happening this year. I'm telling you right now. I think the East is going to be... I don't think
so, but Philly beat them last year. Straight up, both times. Yeah. Those were not close games. Like
it's one of those things... going to be a bloodbath. Like, I think we're going to... Last year, you know, we saw, like, it was a pretty clear... We have these 3 teams. We don't know what order they're going to finish in, but they're clearly going to be in the playoffs, and it was just a matter of seeding, which really came down to, like, basically the last weekend almost, like, figuring out the seeding. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to go into the last 1 or 2 weeks just not even knowing who's going to be in the playoffs. Like, I would not be surprised to get to 2 weeks from the end of the season and only have like a team that's clinched a playoff spot.
All right, so here's my question. Does any East Division team finish with double-digit regular season wins? Do you get a 10-2 team?
No.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think it's just going to be that vicious.
I think it's too hard. And like you look at last year too, like New York had a lot of roster issues like late in the season where they were literally pulling guys off the street, and they were able to do that and still be pretty competitive and like win games against teams in the lower half of that division. I think if they have a situation like that this year where they have to pull guys off the street, they're just going to straight up lose. Like, you cannot, like, with the people that are being added in Toronto and the rumors of other players re-signing back on, like if they can get Phil Turner,
healthy Phil Turner, I just want a healthy Phil Turner, man.
Phil Turner, like you want to, if there is a guy in the league who could maybe keep pace with Ambrose in getting blocks, it's that guy. Mm-hmm. Like, because he is so athletic and so big. Like, when I met him at All-Star Weekend, I got to like kind of see him in person and play with him on the same field. I knew he was athletic and I knew he was big, but seeing him in person and seeing just how big he was and how much space he can take up to match up with the athleticism that he has, I mean, he is unreal as a defender. Completely different style of defender than Ambrose, who's very twitchy and a lot more rangy. And it was just, I think if you get a healthy season out of him, you get some of these guys coming back, you're adding in this talent that's new to the team, like this infusion of excitement. Like, outside of Philly, like, I think all 5 of the other teams in that division on any given day, given what we know right now, can beat any one of the other teams. There's definitely teams that are going to be favored in those matchups, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for any of those teams to beat any of the other ones.
Well, and I think it's going to be like rock, paper, scissors, kind of what I was almost intending to mention with the whole Philly Montreal struggle. It's like Yeah, Philly just matches up well with Montreal, so they win those games. There's so much of that in this league that I love. It's kind of like the NFL in that way, where you might have a really good team and a team that seems to be much lesser than them, but the way in which their lineups just mesh, it's a really close game. I think Chicago has been that way the past couple of seasons too, where maybe you want to chagrin some of their success, but man, when they match up against Minnesota, they know exactly what they're doing, right?
Yep. They find a way. It's just like it's the same way. We've had that with like Madison. Weirdly, like in years where we weren't as good, like where Madison,
you guys have had that a ton.
Like we've had close games with Madison in years where like they were winning, where they only lost 2 games and we, only won like 5, and somehow we'd have a matchup with them where we're tied going into the last few minutes of the fourth quarter, and it just kind of doesn't seem to matter, even in years where they weren't as good too, and it seemed like we were the better team. Again, game's close for no reason. It shouldn't be close, but like it is. It just doesn't matter. They're just matchups like that, like you said. We see this in sports. It's one of the beautiful things about sports when you have a rivalry, when you have 2 teams who really know each other and have so much history. You can kind of throw the records out the window. Like we see this in sports. We just saw this with Michigan and Ohio State in football recently, where Ohio State's clearly the better, more talented team. They're playing in Columbus, Ohio, and Michigan comes in there and wins a game, plants the flag. Like they had no business being in that game. But it doesn't matter, because when it's a rivalry and when you know each other that intimately, the records matter a lot less. And it is a lot more about knowing how to execute and how to find the weaknesses of that team. How to exploit some of the things that they like to do. But yeah, I mean, the news that has been coming in over the last week with free agency, like it's been so exciting, not just because of the new players, but it is pushing it's pushing some of these divisions into just being so much more competitive. Like before the Chicago news, I think everyone just would have been like, man, Minnesota is going to just sweep the Central Division. Like, who's going to hang with them? We get all this news, and now we're like, oh, wow. Now it's like, it looks like a dogfight at the top of the division. We wouldn't have thought 2 seconds about Toronto coming into this season before today and getting all this news of these players that might be returning and these new players, and how that could take them from bottom of the division to competitive with potentially every team in the division, and maybe fighting for a playoff spot, like based on what we've seen right now. And it's just like this level of excitement where everything feels like it's getting more competitive. Everything feels like it's getting closer. The margins are way slimmer. It's awesome.
Well, and how poetic would it be if there was in the East Division this whole flip-flop of Rush were the original sort of kings of that era, the original era in the East Division. New York supplants them with that famous first victory in the East Division championship game in 2018 to make it to championship weekend and thwart the Rush. And then it's the era of the Empire for the next, 5-6 years. Yeah. If now Toronto came back and was the team to eliminate New York from playoff contention for the first time since 2017. Like, we have that in play now. I'm just going to go ahead and dub it 2025 season of the rivalry. It just is. I can feel it from the way that these roster moves and the realignment is happening. Like there are going to be knife fights at the top of each of these 4 divisions. Like there's just no avoiding. I mean, we even touched on the South and Carolina and Atlanta where they left things last year with, Atlanta just putting the host team in essentially a full Nelson for the last 3.5 minutes of the game. Like again, Chicago, Minnesota, even though Madison did make it to the Central Division title game last year, we should save some respect for them too. But yeah, man. I mean, West, any one of these matchups can take it to the next level. I feel like that division is just percolating with blood feuds and stuff. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Colorado, Salt Lake, Oakland, Seattle. I think Colorado, Oakland could have a potential to kick it up a notch because you've had Oakland win in the dramatic fashion in the Bay Area against the Summit to kind of knock them down a peg in each of the past 2 seasons. So I'm excited, man. I know we've been dormant for a couple months. I know that we've been a little lackluster in getting the show going again, but man, it feels good to be back.
Yeah, it does. And, as we mentioned way earlier in the pod at this point, we still got, 3.5 months until we actually start the season. No team has come even close to finalizing rosters, although some are more fleshed out than others. So we're still waiting on a lot of news. I mean, we're still waiting on a lot of potential player movement and, new signings. And it feels like more than any other season, anything can happen, like with player movement. Like it just feels like there are possibilities out there that I can't even dream up, that I can't even think up. And I'm just excited to see where all the cards fall by the time we actually get to, mid-April.
We had an MVP shift to a divisional rival last year, and somehow this feels even more tantalizing already, and we're 2.5 months before the point in which we hit that last year. So let's go, man. Cam and I will be back next week. We'll be talking about championship weekend announcement for the 2025 season. That's the next thing on deck. And then after that, it's going to kind of be the traditional schedule for the offseason. We'll probably get the full team schedules drop at the beginning of February, and then at the beginning of March sometime, full rosters and everything. And then will really be at the event horizon for the 2025 UFA season. That'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass for Cam and I, but we thank you for tuning in again with us, and we will be back with you to bring you more news and commentary from around the league going forward into this year. Can't wait. Talk to you soon. Bye now.